Love that we are being challenged to grow in our worship, different genres, different approaches, all that point to the same thing. A great God who has bridged the gap between ourselves and Him through the person of Jesus Christ. This is the very heart of worship. So thank you for leading us, and thank you, congregation, for continually growing in your worship and embracing these fresh winds. Interestingly enough, an old song, one with which I grew up, that just is so relevant to our situation, our generation today. So, all right, last week was an interesting week for Vicki and me. We actually moved, and it has been a lot of years since we've moved. Any of you all moved recently? Good. Yeah, it's a hassle. And we only moved about 1.5 miles, actually closer to the church, something we've been looking at for about a year or so to do. Downsizing, smaller home, a little more work, but a little less maintenance. But we love project. We always buy the worst house in the neighborhood, and we certainly got our money's worth with this house, and look forward to the work going to be done. I tell you that story because moving is unsettling. In fact, we moved Tuesday night. Thursday morning, about 36 hours later, I had an opportunity to speak over at Tyndall House Publishers to their team early in the morning, and I got up and realized I didn't have any pants that I could wear, and so that created a problem. So I'm sorting through, trying to find pants that are appropriate for a business setting. Got there just in time, spoke, and just began by saying, so I'm glad to be here today, and I have on my pants, and had to give a little bit of explanation as to why it mattered. All that to say, when you move, it's a hassle. There's chaos, there's uncertainty. You look at Nehemiah chapter 2, and Nehemiah, the hero of our narrative, moved. In fact, we're in the third week of this series examining the life of Nehemiah, a man who had moved 800 miles from Persia, the capital, the Persian Empire, Susa, all the way to Jerusalem. He made that move because God had stirred his heart to change some things. Jerusalem for 150 years had lay in ruins. The walls that protected the people, the security of God's people, gone, knocked down. The gates that would open in the morning and close in the evening, allowing people to do business and go about their work and get their food and go shopping, burned to the ground. No security, no prosperity. God's people were in trouble. In fact, 3 times that word is used. The people of God were in trouble. That they were living with shame. That is, they were living ashamed of the area in which they lived. And yet 150 years, and nobody took the initiative to rebuild the walls? You put that into American historical context, Ulysses S. Grant would have been president at the time that happened. And still they're living with all of that mess. We get to Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. 5 words that indicate a life change for Nehemiah. His life would never be the same after this. Chapter 2, Nehemiah, verse 11. So, I went to Jerusalem. That's a lot. That's a lifetime move. Question is, why? Well, why take on the task of rebuilding what had been broken for that long? Why leave what was a secure, cushy civil servant job near to the throne to go to the backwater 800-mile frontier? Why would you do that? Look at verse 10, Nehemiah chapter 2. He says that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. Nehemiah was going to do some good. God's people would benefit. Jerusalem would be restored to be that jewel of the Mideast, that the people of God are secure, and the communities around can look and say, wow, look at what God has done. That hadn't happened in 150 years. And God stirred the heart of Nehemiah to do that. The words we're using in this series to talk about the thing God may be stirring your heart to do is meant for more. In other words, God has meant us, He's created us in His image. We're meant for more than just sort of going through life floating downstream, or sort of taking what life brings us, or living in the disarray of conflict and relationship, or problems we just get used to stepping over the rubble in our lives, as the people of Jerusalem had gotten used to stepping around the rubble for generations. Or maybe meant for more is an opportunity to seize. Nehemiah was willing to act on his deep desire to serve others, to better the lives of God's people. His meant for more was to rebuild the city, restore the walls, put the gates back, and put some order there. The question is, what's yours? What is the problem to solve, or the conflict to resolve, or the opportunity for you to seize? In fact, we may want to answer the question, how do I discover my meant for more? I'm using meant for more as a metaphor for what is it that God's stirring in my heart to do? What is it that I was placed in my current circumstance to accomplish, to benefit not only myself, but others as well? What is your problem to solve, your conflict to resolve? What is your opportunity to seize? The second set of questions you might ask to discover our meant for more. What do you feel? What do you see? What do you want? You remember last week, if you were here, maybe you were watching online, some of our folks do that, or maybe you were traveling, and last week, Nehemiah, chapter 2, the first 9 verses, there's deep feeling. Nehemiah bounced from hurt to fear to anger. One of the ways we determine our meant for more is to recognize, what am I feeling? We don't waste those feelings. We don't move too quickly to soothe our feelings or treat our feelings. We're able to live with some of that hurt or unsettledness or deep emotion. It helps define what it is God may be stirring in our hearts to do. What do you see? The people in Jerusalem had seen broken down walls. That was the report that got to Nehemiah. Oh, the walls are broken down, the gates are burned with fire, the people are in trouble, and they're living with shame. 150 years of that? Nehemiah was one of those rare individuals who saw past the problem to the solution. He saw past the conflict to a restored relationship. He saw past the inevitable challenges with an opportunity to the benefit that would accrue to those who had their opportunity seized. Do you do that? Or are you the kind of person that can look past the rubble and see, you know what, there's a solution out there, and boy, is it going to be good? Can look past the tension in a relationship to the beauty of a relationship that's honest and restored and repaired and forgiven and free? Can you see past the I don't knows of an opportunity to say, you know what, this is going to benefit a lot of people. My life's going to be better. The people of God are going to be stronger. Our family's going to grow in their walk with God. Here's the dream God stirred within my heart, and I want that. And what do you feel? What do you see? What do you want? It's interesting. We closed the message last week by asking that question. Remember when the king said to Nehemiah, Nehemiah, what are you requesting? Now, we can be pretty good about talking about what our hurts are. We can be pretty good at identifying the problems we have, but we're a little less good when somebody says, well, what do you want? Well, no, I'm okay, really? Nehemiah said, what I really want is to leave your employment, king, travel 800 miles to a place I'd never been before, and rebuild the city. That's a big ask. You really? That's what you want? Yeah, that's what I want to do. And we so easily get hung up on how. Oh, he would never say yes. Oh, she would never allow me to take that promotion. Oh, I couldn't start this new division in my company. Oh, man, that issue in my home, we've lived with that for years. Nobody's going to solve that. Really? Why say that so quickly? What do you want? I believe those desires are gifts from God, then they shouldn't be ignored. God's stirring your heart with a deep desire, go for it. As I said last week, when it's in alignment with God's will and it advances God's mission. How do I discover that? And we get to Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 11, and he's acted on that. His heart's been stirred. He can see the rebuilt city, and God's granted him the favor of the king, who's given him the king's credit card to rebuild the city. And he travels. Again, those 5 words. I went to Jerusalem. Now, listen, if this is me, it was 6 months, we know at least, maybe closer to a year. 4 months from when Nehemiah heard about how terrible Jerusalem's situation was. 2 more months to travel from Persia all the way west to Israel. And probably some time to put together the team. You can't just throw the soldiers together and gather all the caravan. So maybe a year's gone by. So if I've had something stir in my heart for a year, and I'm just convinced this is what God has for me and my family or my future, and somebody's given me the credit card to say, here, carte blanche, whatever you want. I'm not going to go to my hotel. I'm going to Home Depot and ordering lumber that day. Look at what Nehemiah does. He's such a good leader. And what's going to become obvious in the next few weeks is Nehemiah's leadership ability in getting done the hard job. And I was there 3 days. Do you know what he did? Nothing. Hopefully he rested. Maybe after an 800-mile trip through the desert on the back of a camel, he probably took a shower, I hope. Don't rush in with all your grand plans for your meant for more. Don't clarify it and walk in and tell your family it's going to be different. Husbands, if that relates to how you're treating your wife or resolving a long-standing conflict, my encouragement to you is don't say, honey, it's going to be different around here starting today. You know what I'm saying? Come on, guys, don't be afraid. Take a few days. In fact, look at verse 12. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. So even after 3 days, now he's on to the 4th night. He says, you know what, we're going to work night shift here. And look, I have this underlined. Look at the middle of verse 12. I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. No billboards. No community rallies. Show up, disappear for 3 days, and then the first time you show yourself, it's under the cover of darkness at night. Maybe he had to wait for a full moon or something, but he's going out at night. Now look at what he does. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode, so it's a very small group, and he was probably on a donkey or something that could pick its way over the rubble. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and the dung gate. I don't even want to know what the dung gate or where the dung gate is. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates had been destroyed by fire. He's very consistent in saying the problem to solve was broken walls, burned gates. I went on to the fountain gate, to the king's pool. There was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. There's too much rubble. Now I had to look this up because I just don't know geography in Jerusalem, 400 years before Christ. But basically, he's going out the west, and he's turning left, and he's going to the south, and he's going by these burned down gates. Well, there's no security at all. And then he gets around the southern edge of the city, begins going back up by the valley gate, which is on the east. And what happens there is it's a very sheer drop-off, and there's too much rubble, he can't get his mount around it. But that didn't stop him. Look at what he does. Verse 15, I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. That means he climbed off of his donkey, and he's climbing up the sheer side of this under cover of darkness and peeking over the top to see the rubble and the ruins of the wall. This guy, he just doesn't take no for an answer. I love that. And it's interesting, the word he uses, look at verse 15. It's used twice. I inspected the wall. The word is used in other contexts in Hebrew for probing a wound to see the extent of the damage. In other words, like we say on staff all the time, facts are your friend. Nehemiah had this vision of what he wanted to do, and he's going to rebuild the walls. First, he had to find out just how bad were the walls. And he did it under the cover of darkness. Look at verse 15, the end. I entered by the valley gate, that's the one he went out of on the west, and I returned. And nothing. Now, the text moves to the next thing, but we don't know if that was days or weeks later. He would have probably written up the report. He would have maybe assigned out the task of, well, who's going to work here and who's going to do that, and what about that gate? And he probably would have had to build a supply list. So maybe another month went by. Look at what happens, though, verse 17. Oh, well, look, verse 16 first. It's sort of a parenthesis. Like, I didn't tell anybody. Look at the end of verse 16. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told. And he lists the people who are going to do the work: Jews, priests, nobles, officials, and the rest who were to do the work. In other words, I didn't say anything. I kept it quiet. It's very intentional on his part. And then, weeks or months later, then I said to them, verse 17, I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? It's amazing how consistent Nehemiah is. All the way back in chapter 1, the report was the people are in trouble. Now, I have 3 words circled in this verse. You see the trouble, look at verse 70. You see the trouble, what's the word? What's the pronoun? Come on, now say it louder. We are in. Until now, much of Nehemiah's language is first person because it's his journal. I this and me and I and my. But when it comes to naming the problem, he's like, it's our problem. He owned it. You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins, its gates burn. Come what's the word? What's the pronoun? Us. He didn't say you have a problem. He said we have a problem. He didn't say, and I have the solution for you to do. He said, let us rebuild. Let us build the wall of Jerusalem. Here it is again, third time the use of the plural. That we may no longer suffer derision. There's that sense of shame again. Right. You've got to own the problem and the solution. And Nehemiah did that. His meant for more involved others, and he made sure he placed himself squarely in the group of those who had the problem. And he was part of the solution as well. He's going to invite them to be a part of it. Look at verse 18. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. Now, this is a building project. If you're proposing a building project, what's the first question anybody ever asks? What's the first question? Cost. How much is it going to cost? Nehemiah didn't lead with that, did he? He led with, God has put his hand on me for good, and we're going to do this thing because it pleases God and benefits his people. I mean, I love that. In fact, he led with God's good hand before he ever got to the budget. Now, by the way, he got to the budget. Look at what happened next. Verse 18 in the middle, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. Hey, man, God stirred my heart, and he's opened the way for me to do this, and God stirred the king's heart, and here's the king's credit card. We can get this thing done and paid for. That's good. The what and the how. Now, look at their response at the end of verse 18, and they said, let us rise up and build. And they kind of caught the purpose of this building. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. The good work. I have that on. It's a good work. Can you see beyond bricks and mortar and rubble to the good thing God is doing in your life? Or your family? Or your church? Or your school? Or your job? People who are meant for more, who get it done, they recognize God's good hand. And they recognize when God is for them. And they don't back down. In fact, look at what happens next. Verse 19 and 20. Sanballat the Horonite, we met him last week, governor of Samaria to the north. And Tobiah the Ammonite servant to the east. Tobiah, that's a name we know from later archaeological digs, very powerful, influential family. But we meet a third foe next, and he's probably the most powerful of them all. Geshem, verse 19, the Arab heard of it. Geshem was in the south. He was very powerful, ran these sort of raiding parties, these nomadic tribes that would sort of lightning raids on cities and carry off all the goods, and very powerful and threatening. And so just so we're clear, God's good hand, and we're going to do this thing, but we have opposition from the north, we have opposition from the east, we have opposition from the south. Wow. Look at their criticism. They jeered at us, and they despised us. That sense of shame. They're trying to shame us. Shame on you. They said, what is this thing you're doing? And look how quickly they go to motive. Are you rebelling against the king? So you're not about doing God's work. You're not about blessing God's people. Nehemiah, you're trying to build a kingdom for yourself, and you're going to rebel against the king. Listen, you're going to get serious about being meant for more. People are going to criticize you. They're going to question your motives. They're going to question your ability. I say let them live with the rubble they're in. You know what FIDO stands for? Forget it. Drive on. Easy to criticize when you're living with the rubble. You're going to try and do something to move the rubble and rebuild. Let them bring on the criticism. Now, his response is not subtle. I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we as servants will arise and build. Hey, we're going to get it done in spite of your criticism and belittling. In fact, God's going to prosper us. Don't be nervous about that. What do you want? God to not prosper his people? He's just quoting here from Joshua chapter 1, verses 7, 8, 9, and 10. And what happens next is very pointed. You individual, you three, you critic, love it. Three things. You have no portion. It speaks of the past. Hey, Jerusalem was given as a gift to God's people. It's our heritage, not yours. You have no right. That speaks of the present. See this letter from the king? Recognize God's good hand is on me for this? Do you recognize we're doing this now because God's called us to do it? And you have no claim in Jerusalem. You can't, that speaks to the future. You can't look back and say, oh, I'm going to put a claim in on that when all this work is done. No, you're not. It's direct. We're going to prosper. We're going to get it done. You have no past, no present, no future claim about this thing. So good. We'll see next week that Nehemiah really gets going and his problems only multiply. You're going to set your hand to do something meant for more. You're going to increase your problems. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But let's think about it. Where we're at, right? We're what? We're into chapter 2 now. This is 3 weeks into an 8-week series. So somebody help me with this, the answer to this question. How much work has actually gotten done yet? How much? None. Like, don't rush into your meant for more. Okay? What do you feel? What's stirring? What do you see? What's the potential beyond the problem? What do you want? What's God stirring in your heart to do? So from this narrative, let's see if we can't answer the question, how do I develop my meant for more? Okay, I've discovered it. What do I do next? Where do I start? Let me give you 3 sort of punchy 2-word imperatives. Do this, and I'll fill them out with 1 sentence that follows, kind of explaining what I mean by that. How do I develop my meant for more? Dream big. God's people should be saying, They should be saying that louder. Amen. They should be saying a little louder, dream big. Amen. Thank you. It's a big dream back there. Love it. 150 years of rubble and burnt gates. God stirred Nehemiah to say, I see a rebuilt wall, and I see secure gates, and I see thousands of people moving into the city, and I see Jerusalem being the thing God had intended it to be in the Old Testament, a beacon of light inviting the nations to see what a good God He is. In fact, you think that's not true? Let me read to you from Psalm 48. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. And all God's people says, yeah, well, praise for what? In the city of our God, the mountain of His holiness, beautiful in elevation, the joy of all the earth. This is Jerusalem. Within her, God has made Himself known as a fortress. Really? A fortress with no walls? We have thought on your steadfast love, O God, in the midst of your temple. I mean, you're promise-keeping God, Lord. The temple had been rebuilt, but there were no walls around the city to protect the worshipers. Let Mount Zion be glad. Mount Zion's that high point where the temple is. It speaks of like, come to worship here. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments. Walk about Zion. Go around her. Now listen. Listen to the invitation of the psalmist. Number her towers. Consider well her ramparts. Go through her citadels. There were none. They were built and busted down to the ground, and the gates were burned. How's this psalm ever going to be a psalm that God's people can sing? Because God stirred Nehemiah to rebuild it. Why is your meant for more worth it? Listen to the rest of the psalm. So that you may tell the next generation that this God is our God. Your courage to lean into your meant for more is going to make a difference in your children and grandchildren's life. That's going to happen. That's why it's worth it. He is our God forever and ever. He will guide us forever. Dream big. Your meant for more will be real in your heart before it's real in the world. Twice Nehemiah says, I didn't tell anybody. And it was so clear in his heart. God's stirring in your heart. You have deep feeling about something. Don't ignore that. Dream big about that. It's going to be real for you before it's real for anybody else. Second, how do I develop my meant for more? Go first. Right? Like 150 years in Nehemiah from 800 miles away said, I'll be that guy. Yeah. And he started the process. Go first. God uses people who take Him at His word. Nehemiah was very clear that God had intended to restore Jerusalem. By the way, Isaiah 58, we looked at it 2 weeks ago. I will call you the restorer of broken walls. I mean, Nehemiah just took God at His word. I want to be that guy. Somebody's got to take that first step. Go first. God uses people who take Him at His word. And expect you're going to get pushback. It's okay. That's why we need the third one. Press on. Press on. Trouble will find you early and often. And all God's people said, yeah, it was a little louder than the last one. Yeah, we got that. I mean, wait, let's just review. God's good hand is on Nehemiah, yes or no? The king is giving him the credit card saying, anything you need, yes or no? The people are saying, let's do this thing, yes or no? So you know what Nehemiah's going to have? Problems. That's what Nehemiah's going to have. He's going to have problems with the king, with the people, with the surrounding towns, with his own team. We have to push through. We have to press on. Trouble will find you early and often. In fact, look at Proverbs 24, verses 6 and 10. I think we have that projected. And it's interesting that these verses are in the same paragraph in the book of Proverbs. If you falter in times of trouble, how small is your strength? I mean, yeah, right? But you just got to press on. But look at the contrast, and Proverbs often contrast two things. Look at the contrast on the other side. Though a righteous man or a righteous woman, a righteous person falls 7 times, say it with me, he rises again. Press on. Work hasn't begun yet. Nehemiah's got problems. And you probably understand what I'm talking about. In fact, let me very quickly give you 3 tools in God's toolbox. A lot of what we're going to talk about going forward is leadership. Nehemiah's leadership, it's on display in the coming chapters. So you're going to seize a meant for more opportunity or resolve a conflict or solve a problem. And here are the tools God's likely to bring to bear in your life to prepare you for leadership. First, monotony. That's a big word for time. 6 months, maybe a year has gone by. Nehemiah's heart's just beating for Jerusalem, and nothing's happened yet. God's forming a leader under time and pressure. Monotony. The second one is obscurity. Who's this guy? Nehemiah what? Where is he from? 800 miles away? He wants to rebuild a little backwater frontier town called Jerusalem? Who does he think he is? No one may know your name. Obscurity may be a big word for loneliness. Misunderstanding. Not being recognized or appreciated. And all along, God's forming Nehemiah for a great task. Monotony, obscurity, and adversity. That's the third tool God's going to bring to bear in your leadership formation. Adversity means trouble. But it's worth it. 3 years ago, our church added on out the back here, student ministry space, office space. It's used 7 days a week these days by the community, by other ministries, by our church and our church family. And we were getting ready to dedicate it. Before we did the flooring, we had actually asked our people to come out with markers and let's write blessings on the floor. There's a family been attending our church for a while named the Noags. We introduced them. We interviewed them last night for a volunteer event here. And they were invited to come out and sign the floor. They had not been that involved in our church. They had known one of our pastors and that. But they signed anyway. In fact, she said, kind of felt weird to sign, like a little almost embarrassed, like we didn't do anything to contribute to this. And here's what they said. Thank you for giving us a place for our family to grow in our faith. In the years since that, they've added to their family. They've grown as a family. And talk about faith growing, Kurt leads men's group. They serve in children's ministry and other ministries and continually wanting to grow. We've had conversations about that. That's a credit to you who were a part of this. They came in new, had nothing to do with that building, and here they are years later growing in their faith. Our church is meant for more, is to double our missions to $1 million. We're going to give $1 million to missions the next 30 months. And we're building 2 buildings, one over at Carroll Stream. I was preaching there a little while ago, and it's so exciting there. In fact, they're getting ready to sign the floors in a few weeks. And we're going to build worship space right out here to the north. My invitation for you to be a part of our Meant for More is not simply sign on the floor, do that, but will you join us so that 3 or 5 or 30 years from now, someone else can look back and say, thank you for moving forward the mission of the gospel so that they could grow. Let me pray over you that God helps you discover and then begin to develop the meant for more, the thing God's calling you to do. We'll do this thing together. Father, I am so grateful for your faithfulness to us. Lord, for the way that you stir our hearts, sometimes through deep hurt or disappointment or pain. And still, Father, you call us to make a difference. Lord, will you make that so in the lives of the men and women here, those who are watching us online from afar or who will see this later? Lord, to feel deeply, to see clearly, to be open about what we want so that people are benefited. Your mission moves forward. Thank you, Lord, that Jesus Christ is the one who lived and died and rose again for our sins, that he gave of himself to benefit us, that we have eternal life because of our faith in him. And may our church always hold forth this message. May those things that we do, those things that we build, the money that we give, always advance the mission, I pray. And Lord, help us to rise up and build as you stirred the hearts of God's people in Nehemiah's day. Stir our hearts today, I pray. We ask this in Jesus' strong name. And all God's people said,